Last month I got a surprising letter from the Bank of the West where the minister's discretionary fund, that fund that is used mostly to help people in need, is kept. They had debited the account for the check I had deposited, and giving as their reason, quote, "The check has not been presented to the issuing bank." Couldn't quite understand that, so I called to inquire, and 3 telephone calls later I got this answer. The check had been accidentally shredded by the bank before being properly processed. So, since they couldn't collect it, they had debited my account. "Wait," I said, "wait. Are you telling me that I entrusted you with a perfectly good check? You accidentally destroyed it, so you took the money out of my account?" "Well," they said, "we can't collect the money. We don't have the check anymore. We don't know who it was, where it came from. Only you know that." And I said I would be glad to tell them how they might recover the money that they had lost. But in the meantime, I said, "I think you've just stolen $250 from me, and I don't like that." The woman on the other end of the line was gracious enough to admit that she saw my point herself, but she was powerless to do anything about it. She gave me another phone number. 2 days and a dozen phone calls later, the 3rd or 4th layer of bank officials I talked to, carefully explaining to their surprised questions exactly why it seemed to me that they had stolen my money, one wise woman finally restored the account. Accidents happen. I know that accidents happen. Sometimes embarrassed workers can try to slide their accidents through in unorthodox ways, but it's pretty clear to me that that's not what happened here. Because it wouldn't have taken 5 layers of supervisors to correct an accident or an employee misdeed. No, it was clear that the policy from the top at the Bank of the West is, whenever something happens that means we don't get the profit we expected, somebody else should pay. That's not the wisdom of robust capitalism. Robust capitalism knows that its customers, its reputation, and the services it renders are its greatest assets. No, that somebody else should pay, that's the arrogance of power. That's the attitude of bullies. That's the way the oligarchies and plutocracies of the Third World work. It's not how we do things here in America. At least, not the America I grew up in. And I'm sad and I'm angry. Actually, I've been sad and angry for a long time, though only in the past year or so have I actually felt personally touched by these changes. Through my whole adulthood, I've watched something go on that I think is terribly dangerous to the values and the nation I care about. The rich have gotten richer and richer and richer and richer and more and more and more powerful, taken more of the nation's resources for themselves, used their power to tax themselves less and less, manipulated the political arena more and more aggressively, done themselves more and more favors, taken foolish risks with the economy that supports everybody except them because they're too rich for the economy to matter very much. But it sure made a difference to me and to you, to my life savings, to this church's ability to build more space, to you, I know. These super rich can buy the media. They've convinced just enough people of this nation that the real problem is public employee pensions, union contracts, medical care, and Social Security. They have declared not only that they should have free speech rights to manipulate the political system, but their corporations that they own should have free speech rights also. American democracy is rapidly turning into a sham. Maybe it already has, in everything but our hearts. But our hearts are important. And our hope is crucial to what happens next. And because the only way back from this brink is for everybody to clearly understand what's happened, I'm going to, for a moment, quit sermon mode and enter lecture mode. I even brought my PowerPoint. This is complicated stuff, and as you all know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. There are a lot of statistics and numbers. We all know how slippery numbers are. I'm at the mercy here of charts and graphs that other people have put together, so not all these numbers are going to add up beautifully. The important thing is not the exact numbers. The important thing is the trend. I know that most of you, probably all of you, are aware of this trend, but you may be underestimating the scope of what's happened in the last 40 years, especially in the last 10 years to our nation. And here's our first slide, maybe. Oh, look at this. Wow. This pie chart. Oh, and you know what? We need these top lights out. Can somebody do that? Just in the hall there? Thanks. This pie chart shows the distribution of wealth in our nation by two different definitions of wealth. The wealth of families, including the houses they own, which is called net worth, and the wealth of families not including the houses they own, which is called financial wealth, because it's not easy to sell your house and use that equity. Therefore, many experts think that financial wealth is really the more important number, and it's the one on the right. And you see something that shouldn't surprise you unless you've been in a deep sleep. 43% of the nation's wealth is owned by 1% of its people. This chart is from 2007, by the way. Things have gotten worse since then. But I'm not going to quibble with that. 43% is too much power and too many resources for any 1% of the population to have or use or be wise with. And everything that's happened since 2007 certainly proves that. The rest of the chart is pretty sobering, too. The next 4% owns another 30% of the nation's resources. The bottom 80% of the population owns only 7% of its resources. And if these numbers don't paint a picture for you, here's a slide that will. It's a slightly different parsing of figures showing just how little the bottom 40% owns of the collective pie. That's that red dot down there in Texas. And this is not what democracy looks like. Democracy looks more like the bottom bar on this graph. At least that's what the great majority of Americans from all walks of life are pretty much agreed on in terms of how wealth should be distributed. They think that the poorest 20% of the population should have about 10% of the wealth, the top 20% should own between 30 and 40% of the wealth, and the rest somewhere in between. The majority of Americans from all walks of life know that this ideal is not realized in this nation. Actually, it's so ideal it's not realized anywhere in the world. And researchers then gave them the opportunity to say what they think the distribution of wealth really is. And the guess they made is the middle bar. This was done in 2010 before the Occupy movement began. 90% of a random sample of 5,500 Americans, no matter their level of education or income, 90% agreed that the middle bar is where America really is. They were wrong, of course. America really is the top bar, which only looks like it has 3 categories, but because the bottom 2 are so small, they are invisible. That is to say, 125 million Americans, 40% of us altogether, have 0.3% of the wealth of the nation. Most Americans know there's more wealth in the top 20% than they think is ideal, but they vastly underestimate how much is really there. They think there's a little over 50%, when in actuality it's a little over 80%. The researchers were so struck by how wrong the average person is about the facts of wealth distribution in America that they repeated their study with 24 academic economists who, as you might imagine, did better. They guessed that the poorest 40% of Americans owned only 2% of the wealth, which is too high by a factor of 7. This chart carries the hope of our nation for its future. Hold on to it. And I'll speed through several more. The inequality of wealth is further skewed by race and ethnicity. These 3 sets of bar graphs show the relative wealth of white, African American, and Hispanic households. The first block are median household income, which is problematic but not shocking. When you measure net worth, including home value, we get a much harsher picture, the second block of 3. The third set of bars shows what happens when you show financial wealth, which, as you remember, excludes non-liquid home value, and you see a truly distressing picture of national inequality and suffering. The next slide shows the age gap of wealth in this nation between households of retired people and households of young adults. Of course, we expect retired adults, especially newly retired adults, to have considerably more net worth than young adults, but this is a big gap. And you see how it's grown from 1985, when I was a young adult. Now, I know that you know that CEO compensation has skyrocketed over the past few years. Here goes. Next slide. This slide shows executive compensation compared to average worker pay in major corporations and Wall Street firms from 1985 to now. Executive compensation was, in 1985, about 25 times that of the average worker. 2 years ago, executive compensation was 230 times that of the average worker, and this discrepancy has increased in the last 2 years to over 300%. So let me just draw you a word picture. In this church budget, $750,000 a year, we employ a staff of 25 people, most of whom are part-time workers, the majority of whom are child care workers who are young and work for us only a few hours a week. However, our average worker pay, if you extrapolate to full-time, is $25,000 a year. If we were a big corporation operating like Wall Street, our CEO salary would be, hold on to your seats, $7.5 million a year. Right. And I wouldn't take it, so don't offer it to me. Because I call that immoral. While it is certainly true that some people make a more vital, creative contribution to any enterprise than others do, and that pay differential is a useful thing, the idea that the hours of one person's life are worth almost 300 times the hours of another person's life, it just doesn't compute. It's to be noticed that the enormous gains in productivity and wealth were made in the days when CEO salaries were 20 to 40 times that of the average workers. Everything else, in my opinion, beyond 20 to 40 times is stealing. The less powerful stealing from the more powerful. The more powerful stealing from the less powerful, like that bank that tried to steal from the minister's fund to cover their mistake. They seem to think they deserve it, these highly paid one-percenters. While it's true that some have come forward and practically begged to be more fairly taxed, most apparently think of themselves as job creators. Although it is to be noticed that they have significantly failed in that respect in these same several years, that their income has grown by 150%. They seem to think that they deserve even more for doing even less. House Speaker John Bonner said in September that the job creators are on strike. I guess he thinks they did this on purpose. I would like to think they didn't. But I guess he thinks they did it on purpose so they could have an even larger share of the national pie. I don't know how you feel about that. That's against my religion. Anyway, executive pay is not based on good performance either. Here's one last slide for the morning lecture. The top line is executive pay through 2005. So you see the trend, which has only gotten worse in the last 6 years. The next line down is the Standard & Poor's 500 index. Good, but way below compensation. The next line is actual corporate profit, also good, but nowhere near executive compensation. There's just no way you can say that the increases in national wealth have been shared fairly either. You can make a good case that they haven't been shared at all. The bottom two lines, the flat ones, those are worker pay and federal minimum wage. The people who actually did the work got nothing. End of lecture. Back to the sermon. Back to hope, meaning, and faith. This has been a hard sermon to write. First I thought it would be about the Occupy movement. Then I thought it would be about Wall Street. Finally I called it, How Can We Occupy Hope? This state of affairs, this ever more radical inequality, this concentration of economic power and therefore political power in ever smaller numbers of people is a very discouraging state of affairs. Most of the world's religions warn against this. They teach that this is not God's will, that it's not fair, that it's not respectful of all God's children. Jesus had more to say about the spiritual problems of wealth than any other single topic. You'd never know that, but it's true. And in this, he was being a good Jewish prophet. Islam solves the problem of wealth inequality and distribution by recommending a flat tithe for everybody. Not a flat tithe on income, by the way, a flat tithe on assets. Eastern religions also warn against the accumulation of too much wealth or too much power. And as for Unitarian Universalists, we who put our faith in the dignity of all people, in the democratic process, in world community, there is nothing in the current state of national affairs which accords with our faith either. At this discouraging moment, I remind you of the difference between hope and mere optimism. Optimism is the freckless thought that things will get better even if we stay on the same comfy path. But hope is that things can change course. And if we change course, things could get better. I lectured because I have faith in democracy, in people, even those who've lately grabbed the power and the money they could get, because that is how people act if you let them. If I'd been playing history professor today, I could have showed you slides that would tell this tale. We've been here before as a nation in human history, and the power of the people working fast or slow has changed this state of affairs before. I take great hope in the fact that the American people have an ideal that is quite egalitarian, and that one issue before our nation is that the people, even the professional people, don't realize how far from their ideal we have strayed. That's a solvable problem. And I see that the movements have started. Not just the street theater Occupy movement with its youthful energy and its innovative spirit, and the more staid 99% movement, but even the Tea Party movement is an outcry against things as they are, and the three groups are starting to see that they have some common solidarity. That's how hope starts to gain ground. And while I deplore police brutality, as was demonstrated by the Davis, California police on Friday, police brutality galvanized this nation during the civil rights era. It convinced everybody that this was indeed their problem. It, like bank stories and pie charts, demonstrates the dangers of overweening power and pride. About the same time as my discussions with the Bank of the West about their attempted theft from the minister's discretionary fund, William and I went to an Occupy rally here in Albuquerque one Saturday. We made our signs and we followed the sounds of drumming to a crowd several hundred out on Central Avenue. The police cruised by occasionally. And then when the crowd started to march in the street, they came in force to press the crowd back to the safety and propriety of the sidewalk. In the midst of doing that, they obligingly held up traffic so the whole group could cross Central Avenue all at once. We walked and we chanted, "We are the 99%. We are the 99%. And then, this is what democracy looks like. Try it. This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like." On we marched, down to the camp where UNM was still tolerating in one of its parks. And the police drove by, thanking the crowd for staying on the sidewalk, wishing us all a good day. And I thought, this is what democracy looks like. People expressing themselves, police keeping everybody safe and traffic moving, and not much seeming to get done. Democracy is messy and costly and inefficient. Events since have proved it to be even messier. Last week saw several occupations forcibly ended, but don't lose hope on that account, because the Occupy movement had already succeeded. They did something so successful that I think you might find it hard to remember what the world was like before them. Before Occupy, the national conversation was all about deficits and how dangerous they suddenly seemed to be after all these years when they didn't seem so dangerous, and all about how the only way to avoid their dangers was the ruthless cutting of basic services, safety nets, pensions, and the earnings of public servants. Remember that? Back in August. Occupy changed the conversation to the distribution of wealth, and it alerted frustrated, sad, angry citizens to their power. The 99% have some resources after all, and we vote. Changing the conversation in this media-centered society is not easy to do, and it is always the first battle. They won it for us. Now it's up to us to keep the conversation changed, to keep the pressure on our new knowledge, to arm ourselves with facts, to move our money to local banks, to ready ourselves for whatever comes next. That's what democracy looks like. The pilgrims, whose hardships and triumphs we celebrate this week, the ones who waited and suffered and packed up and moved and took huge risks for what they believed in, they would understand this period of preparation, waiting, uncertainty, and sadness. And they would, I think, counsel continued learning and also continued togetherness and also continued gratitude for all that we have, for the hope that is so much a part of our future, and for all that we have been. As we go into this Thanksgiving season together, let us remember them.